This is a video response to Becky Rose, a YouTuber that I've discovered only recently, and she's been putting out very interesting, very humorous videos using miniatures and maps and talking about things from a fantasy perspective, often an experience in LARPing and fantasy reenactment and that sort of thing. So pretty broad base of experience from which to draw, and makes for interesting, funny videos. Today's video, or at least the video I saw today, was on Fumbles. And the video comes out and says that while criticals are okay, and the examples used were from a D20 system, while criticals are okay to have a 5% chance of being awesome, a 5% chance of fumbling, rolling a 1 on a D20, is far too high. And on this point, I completely agree. If the examples that she presents in the clip are what the hobby at large is choosing to do. Like the original poster, I have a pretty extensive background in, armed and unarmed combat of different types. Fairly long history in full contact martial arts, particularly with weapons of the type that are modeled in fantasy games, staves and swords and things. And the idea of a combatant in that kind of environment, even in the perfect situation of an interior setting, or the less than perfect situation of a beach, gravel, grassy hill, wet grassy hill, rocks, even in these less than perfect environments, the idea of a combatant dropping their weapon 5% of the time is pretty ridiculous. My friends and I, with broken and bloody fingers, didn't experience this in very rough and tumble sparring. I see no reason why hard-bitten professional fighters in more realistic armor are going to experience it more than we would, particularly when the goal is not to hone skills to save your life, but actually save your life. So yeah, that 5% of dropping your weapon, having your pants come off, or falling down humorously, I think is problematic. But I find that the things that we don't like in our games, more often than not, we're blaming the mechanics when it's the implementation or the interpretation which should be taking the brunt of the blame. Now, a 5% chance of something that you don't like happening in a fight, that seems pretty normal to me. There's lots of times in a sparring match just between friends, or in a heated competition when you're definitely not feeling like a friend, where there are lots of times when you think, I'm in the wrong place, I'm not fast enough, how did he get there, whatever, all right, where you're in a disadvantageous position. I feel that that's really what's intended by the fumble, and if it's not, it's certainly what we can intend the fumble to be. It doesn't have to be something embarrassing. It doesn't have to be something that destroys the perception of your character as a professional fighter or whatever. It can be more practical, or to use the dreaded word, more realistic, simply by understanding what's around in the scene. What is the terrain? What are the conditions? What's been going on? What's the level of fatigue between the combatants, and that sort of thing. It could be something as simple as just missing by a hair's breadth and now being out of position and feeling more vulnerable. Right? This could actually be more vulnerable by having some kind of bonus to hit for the enemy, or a penalty to initiative for you, or whatever your system requires or needs or allows. But the idea is that the fumble doesn't have to be interpreted as some kind of dread action like, wow, you suddenly have no weapon. Right? It can simply be rising stress, or it can be some kind of positional advantage or modifier applied mechanically. Often we blame the mechanic when it's our own implementation of the mechanic which is not meshing right with the group that we have. It's too realistic. It's not funny enough for the group that we're playing with on Tuesday, and it's far too loose and funny for the group we're playing with on Thursday. Right. Your mileage, as always, will vary. But I enjoyed watching the original video. If you haven't seen it yet, I think you should. And think about the role of fumbles and criticals, if there are any, in your system. Most of the games I play actually don't incorporate this mechanic. They uses something else for this kind of interaction or interpretation during stressful scenes. But when it appears in a game, I certainly don't mind it. It can add a lot, as long as we're given the opportunity to make it add a lot, and we're not required to humiliate the character as a process. Something else I might like to add at the end of this video is that in some systems it may be stated very clearly that the game master decides what happens on a fumble, but not all systems are like that. Some, the player will always narrate how their character interacts with the emerging fiction that the group is developing through their play. So fumble, normal success, critical success, or failure. It's the player who decides what they actually did. Right? The interpretation of what they did with what other people in the scene or other things in the scene did is left to the group or left to the player and the game master together. So these fumbles can be just as empowering or interesting, just as revealing of character as anything else in the system. What does it mean when that 5% chance or that whatever percent chance that something you don't like has happened in combat actually happens? What does it show us about the character? How do they recover from that disadvantageous situation? I think that's a valuable thing to have in a game. Again, providing that the game flows to the benefit of the group. Anyway, I've talked long enough for a video response. Thanks, if you've come this far, for listening.